I opened my banking app with one hand while the coffee went cold on the counter, already rehearsing how I'd explain the deposit to the realtor later that morning. The house on Maple Ridge wasn't perfect. The porch sagged a little, and the oak tree out front had cracked the sidewalk. But it was solid, and it was ours, at least in my head. I refreshed the screen once, then again, waiting for the number I'd stared at for years to settle into place. Instead, the balance blinked and showed nothing. Not low, not pending, empty. I told myself it was a glitch. Apps glitched all the time. I closed it, opened it again, typed my password carefully, like precision might summon the truth I wanted. Still empty. I checked the second account, the one where the house fund sat untouched, protected, or so I believed. That one was empty too. My chest didn't tighten the way I expected. It dropped, slow and heavy, like something sinking out of reach. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I tapped my sister's name and waited for the ring that always came. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. I sent a text that was careful and polite, as if this were a scheduling mistake instead of my future disappearing. The message showed delivered. It was never read. By the time I set the phone down, I understood two things at once. The money was gone, and the only person who knew where it had gone had vanished with it. I sat at the small kitchen table and stared at the wall until the shock softened enough to hurt. This wasn't a rainy day fund. This was every extra shift I'd taken, every grocery list trimmed down, every night I'd stayed up filling out paperwork after Ethan fell asleep. It was the promise I'd made to my son that we wouldn't always be moving, that someday we'd have a place where the walls stayed the same. Losing it felt less like theft and more like breaking my word to him. I tried Rachel again, then an old number, then her email. Nothing. I opened my laptop and checked her social media out of pure reflex. Her profiles were gone. Not private. Gone. Like she had stepped off the map. The house felt too quiet. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on wet pavement, the world continuing as if nothing had changed. I thought about the folder in my bag with the listing details, the one I'd shown Ethan the night before. I'd traced the route to school with my finger and watched his careful smile, the one he used now, testing joy before trusting it. I heard his door open down the hall. Small footsteps padded into the kitchen. Ethan stopped when he saw my face. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just looked at the phone on the table, then at my shoulders, hunched like I was bracing for impact. He sat across from me and waited. I picked up the phone again and scrolled through the transaction history, hoping to see a reversal, a pending note, anything that suggested this could be fixed quickly. There was nothing, just clean lines where our future had been. For the first time, anger crept in, sharp and focused. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that asks questions and remembers details. I told Ethan I needed a minute and stood too fast, the room tilting slightly as I crossed to the sink. Cold water ran over my hands, numbing and real. In the reflection of the window, I barely recognized myself. I looked older than my years, thinner somehow, like something essential had been taken along with the money. When I turned back, Ethan was still there, backpack by his feet, even though it wasn't time to leave yet. He watched me with a seriousness that didn't belong on a 10-year-old face. I opened my mouth to reassure him, to promise things I didn't know how to keep, but the words wouldn't line up. "It's okay," I said finally, because it was the safest lie I could manage. He nodded, accepting the sound of the words more than their meaning, and went to make toast. The small normality of it hurt. I watched the toaster lever click down and pop up, the smell filling the kitchen, and wondered how something so ordinary could exist alongside this. As the morning crept on, the shock thinned and the questions sharpened. Banks didn't empty accounts without a trace. Money didn't vanish on its own. and Rachel hadn't just stopped answering. She had erased herself. That realization settled in my chest with a cold certainty. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up with a phone call and an apology. I sat back down and pulled the folder from my bag, spreading the papers out under the weak kitchen light. The pre-approval letter looked ridiculous now, a promise written in ink that no longer meant anything. I thought about the months I'd spent trusting someone else to keep watch while I focused on surviving, on being a good mother, on getting through each day without falling apart. Ethan finished his toast and carried his plate to the sink. He climbed onto the chair beside me and swung his legs, quiet and observant. He didn't ask about the house or the money. He just sat there, close enough to remind me what mattered when everything else started to slip. I checked my phone one more time. No new messages, no missed calls. Rachel's name sat there unchanged, as if nothing had happened. I understood then that whatever came next wouldn't be solved by pleading or panic. The person I trusted had made a choice, and that choice had consequences that reached far beyond a bank balance. As I gathered the papers back into the folder, a single thought took shape, steady and uncomfortable. This wasn't the day my savings disappeared. It was the day I finally had to look at how easily I'd handed my future to someone else. I sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan left for school, my phone face down like it might accuse me if I looked at it again. The shock had dulled into something heavier, slower. Questions. Not the frantic kind, but the kind that line up and wait their turn. This hadn't begun this morning. I knew that much. Whatever Rachel had done, it had roots. And those roots were tangled in choices I had made when I was barely holding myself together. The memory didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through details I'd been avoiding. An old email thread. A password reminder. The way my hand hesitated over the keyboard when I tried to log into the account I hadn't checked myself in months. I remembered the weeks after my husband died, how time felt warped, like every day stretched too long and passed too fast at the same time. Paperwork piled up. Forms arrived with deadlines that felt cruelly indifferent to grief. Rachel had come over with grocery bags and a voice that sounded certain. She talked while I nodded. She said I shouldn't have to think about money right then. She said it was too much for one person, that she could help keep things organized until I felt steadier. It sounded reasonable. It sounded kind. I was exhausted, drowning in decisions, and grateful for anything that promised relief. The first yes was small enough to miss. I let her hold on to documents so I wouldn't lose them. I shared account access so she could check on things while I focused on Ethan. She framed it as temporary, a bridge until I found my footing again. I told myself I was still in control. She was my sister. Trusting her felt natural, almost necessary, in a season where everything else had fallen apart. Her help settled into routine. She'd call and say she'd moved money to a better place, that she'd taken care of something so I wouldn't have to. I thanked her. I meant it. When you're tired enough, delegation feels like survival. I didn't question the details because questioning required energy I didn't have. And because nothing bad happened at first, I let that quiet reassurance carry more weight than it deserved. Over time, the updates replaced my own involvement. I stopped logging in regularly. If I needed to know a balance, I asked her. She always had an answer, quick and confident. She talked about the fun like it was a shared project, using we and our plan. When I mentioned Ethan, she'd smile and say everything was for his future anyway, as if that settled it. I remember the first time discomfort flickered. I asked to see a full statement, and she laughed lightly, told me I was stressing myself out. She said I needed to trust her. The word landed heavier than it should have. Trust. I felt embarrassed for asking, like a child being told not to touch something fragile. So I backed down. I told myself I was being ungrateful. She was helping, Why make it harder? The shift was subtle, but it was there. I noticed that when I asked questions, her tone changed. Not angry, patient, the kind of patience that implies you're the problem. She explained things as if I were too emotional to understand, too overwhelmed to be objective. And because part of me believed that might be true, I let her. There was a moment I should have paid attention to, one that replayed now with uncomfortable clarity. I'd asked about a delay I noticed, a transfer that didn't line up with what I expected. She didn't answer right away. She changed the subject, then followed up later with a vague explanation that sounded plausible if you didn't look too closely. I remember feeling a tightness in my chest and ignoring it. Pushing back would have meant conflict, and conflict felt dangerous then. I needed support. I couldn't afford to lose it. Looking back, I could see the pattern forming, clean and deliberate. Help turned into habit. Habit turned into dependence. Dependence turned into control. Not because she forced it, but because I allowed it to grow unchecked. I had been so focused on surviving the present that I hadn't protected the future. The present snapped back into focus with a hum from the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. I was alone at the table, papers spread out, the house fund no longer abstract but painfully real in its absence. Rachel's disappearance made sense now. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the final step of a process she had been guiding for a long time. I felt regret, sharp and specific, but it didn't turn inward the way it might have before. I wasn't stupid. I had been vulnerable. There was a difference, and recognizing it mattered. The decisions I'd made back then came from grief and exhaustion, not ignorance. Still, intentions didn't erase consequences. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old messages, reading them with new eyes. The reassurance, the certainty, the subtle dismissal of my doubts. It all lined up in a way that was impossible to ignore now. Rachel hadn't woken up one morning and decided to take everything. She had prepared for the day she could. As I set the phone down again, a different question took shape, quieter but more unsettling than the rest. If I had missed this, if I had explained away every warning sign, what else had I overlooked? And more importantly, what had my son seen all along that I hadn't been willing to face? Ethan moved through the house the next morning like he was tiptoeing around something invisible. He didn't ask for the house fund or the phone. He didn't ask about Rachel. He made his bed carefully, lined his shoes by the door, and ate his cereal without turning on the TV. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was observant. Like he was watching to see what I would do next. I tried to keep things normal. I asked if he wanted toast. I reminded him to grab his jacket. My voice sounded steady enough, but it felt borrowed, like I was using someone else's calm. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted to the phone on the counter, face down, deliberately ignored. I could feel the urge to reach for it humming under my skin. Not to get answers, to relieve the pressure of not knowing. The clock ticked, the refrigerator kicked on. The ordinary sounds of the house felt louder than they ever had. I wondered how long a child could carry uncertainty before it started to shape them in ways you couldn't undo. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. Ethan's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, then continued. He didn't look at me when he spoke. Mom. I turned toward him, already bracing. Yeah, buddy. He studied the edge of his bowl, tracing a small chip in the ceramic with his finger. You don't have to keep calling her. I waited, certain I'd misheard. Calling who? Aunt Rachel, he said. The words were simple. His tone wasn't angry or sad. It was settled. You don't have to call her aunt anymore. For a moment, my mind scrambled for explanations that would make this easier. Titles didn't matter. Kids didn't understand the complexity of adult mistakes. Family was family. The excuses lined up automatically, ready to protect me from the truth. Then I saw his face, not confused, not seeking reassurance. He had already reached his conclusion. "Why do you think that?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. He shrugged, a small lift of his shoulders that felt too old for him. "Because family doesn't do that," he said. "They don't take your house money and disappear." The sentence landed quietly, but it cracked something open in my chest. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded anything. He had stated a rule as clearly as if it were written down somewhere he'd already read. I realized then that he hadn't just noticed what happened. He had categorized it. I swallowed. "It's complicated." He nodded. "I know." He looked up at me then, eyes steady. "But you keep calling her, and she keeps not answering. That makes it worse." I thought about the calls I'd made, the texts I'd sent, the way I'd kept reaching for someone who had already chosen not to be there. I thought about what that must look like from the other side of the table. A mother chasing someone who had hurt them, teaching by example that harm was negotiable if it came from the right person. "Does it make you mad?" I asked. He considered that. "Not really," he said. "It just makes me tired." The word hit me harder than anger would have. Tired. He was 10. He shouldn't be tired of adults managing consequences that weren't his to carry. "I don't want you to be sad," I said. "I'm not," he said. "I just don't want us to pretend." There it was. The thing I'd been doing without admitting it, pretending that if I stayed calm enough, patient enough, understanding enough, this would sort itself out. Pretending that the right combination of words could pull someone back into being who they used to be. I reached across the table and took his hand. He squeezed back, firm and warm. Not reassurance. Solidarity. "I think you're right," I said quietly. "We don't have to pretend." He nodded once, satisfied, and finished his cereal. Then he carried his bowl to the sink and went to get his backpack, humming softly to himself. The normalcy of it felt like a small mercy. When he left for school, the house didn't feel empty the way it had before. It felt clarified. I picked up my phone and turned it over. Rachel's name sat there, unchanged, a familiar label attached to something that no longer fit. For the first time, I didn't feel pulled toward it. I felt finished. I didn't block her. I didn't delete her number. I just stopped reaching for it. The difference mattered. Blocking felt reactive, loud. This felt deliberate, final in a quieter way. As the day moved on, I noticed something else shift. The anxiety that had been spiking every time the phone buzzed eased. The urge to explain myself to an absent audience faded. In its place was a steadier focus, the kind that comes when you stop trying to manage other people's reactions and start managing your own responsibilities. That afternoon, I sat at the table again and organized the paperwork I'd avoided for months. Statements, notes, dates. I didn't feel brave. I felt clear. There was a difference. When Ethan came home, he went straight to his room and started his homework without asking if there were updates. He trusted that if something mattered, I would tell him. That trust felt heavier than any amount of money I'd lost. I realized then that his words hadn't been about cutting someone out of our lives in anger. They had been about drawing a line so we could stand somewhere solid. He had given me permission to stop performing loyalty at the expense of safety. As evening settled in and the phone stayed quiet, I understood something that surprised me. Silence wasn't something happening to me anymore. It was something I had chosen. And in that choice, I felt a strength I hadn't known I'd lost. I didn't know what Rachel would do next. I only knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't chase, I wouldn't plead, and I wouldn't teach my son that family was a reason to endure harm. Whatever came after this, it would start from that line. The first call came just after noon. Rachel's name lit up the screen, bright and familiar, and my hand moved toward it before my mind caught up. muscle memory. Years of answering without thinking. I stopped myself an inch from the phone and let it ring. When it went quiet, something inside me steadied instead of collapsing. I set the phone face down and opened my laptop. If I was going to stop reacting, I needed to start acting. I pulled up my bank portal and began downloading statements, month by month, account by account, dates, amounts, destinations I didn't recognize. The work was tedious, almost boring, and that was a relief. Boredom meant I wasn't spiraling. It meant I was thinking. When the phone rang again, I didn't look. I knew who it would be. I knew the rhythm already, the way urgency would build if I didn't respond. The silence stretched, uncomfortable but intact. I realized how often I had been trained to fill that space, to prove I was reasonable, cooperative, still on her side. Sitting there, I understood that silence wasn't passive. It was a refusal to play my old role. I called the bank and kept my voice level. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't explain my family history. I said I couldn't locate my funds and needed a review. The woman on the line asked careful questions and typed while I answered. When she said the transfers appeared structured, not accidental, my stomach dropped and then settled. Structured meant intentional. Intentional meant this wasn't something I could talk my way out of. By mid-afternoon, my inbox chimed with a confirmation email. A review had been opened. Certain movements were flagged. I closed the laptop and sat back, absorbing the weight of that. Whatever Rachel had planned, it was now moving through systems that didn't care about excuses or shared childhoods. I checked my phone. 10 missed calls. The messages had shifted. The first few were concerned, almost tender. "Are you okay? Please call me. We need to talk." Then the edge crept in. "Why are you doing this? You're making things worse." I noticed what wasn't there. No apology, no question about Ethan, just pressure. I took screenshots and saved them. It felt strange, documenting my own sister like evidence, but the act itself was clarifying. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting us. Doubt tried to wedge its way back in. What if silence escalated things? What if I was being cruel? I imagined future conversations with relatives, the raised eyebrows, the careful questions. Why didn't you just talk to her? The old guilt stirred, the instinct to smooth over discomfort before it turned into conflict. I went to Ethan's room and found him sprawled on the floor, building something out of mismatched blocks. He looked up and smiled, easy and unburdened. "Can you help me with this part?" he asked, holding up a crooked tower. I sat down and steadied the base while he added pieces. The structure wobbled, then held. Watching it settle felt like a small lesson I hadn't realized I needed. Stability didn't come from rushing to fix every shake. Sometimes it came from not adding more weight. Back in the kitchen, the phone buzzed again. The tone had changed. The messages were shorter now, sharper. "Call me now. This isn't funny. You're hurting everyone." The shift was unmistakable. Concern had given way to control. Reading them, I felt less afraid and more certain. This wasn't remorse. It was damage control. I resisted the urge to respond with explanations or boundaries spelled out in neat sentences. I remembered the attorney's advice. Don't engage directly. Let the process work. Engagement would only reopen the door she kept trying to force. As evening approached, a relative I hadn't spoken to in months texted to ask if everything was okay. I didn't reply. Not yet. I wasn't ready to narrate my pain for an audience. The story would spread without my help. It always did. The phone kept buzzing. I silenced it and set it in a drawer. The quiet that followed was thick but clean. I cooked dinner, helped with homework, listened to Ethan talk about a science project. Life didn't pause for betrayal. It kept moving, and that felt important. After Ethan went to bed, I took the phone out again. The count had climbed. More calls. More messages. One stood out, different in tone. You don't understand what you're risking. Please just say something so I can fix this. Fix what exactly? The question hovered without needing an answer. Whatever she needed from me, it wasn't forgiveness. It was cooperation. I saved the message and put the phone back down. My hands were steady. I wasn't enjoying this. There was no satisfaction in watching someone unravel. There was only a growing clarity about where my responsibility ended. That night, I slept without checking the phone once. When I woke before dawn, the sky pale and quiet, I realized something had shifted for good. Silence wasn't a punishment I was delivering. It was a boundary I was maintaining. By choosing not to respond, I wasn't escalating the situation. I was stepping out of it. And whatever Rachel was afraid of losing as the hours passed, it wasn't my job to hold it together anymore. The phone stayed quiet as the morning light filled the kitchen. I poured coffee and breathed in the steam, aware that consequences were unfolding somewhere beyond my control. For the first time since the money disappeared, that didn't terrify me. It grounded me. I woke to my phone vibrating so hard against the nightstand it rattled the lamp. For a split second, I thought it was an alarm I'd forgotten to turn off. Then I saw the screen. Missed calls stacked like a column, messages piling up faster than I could read them. I picked the phone up and felt the hum travel through my palm. Relentless, insistent. I didn't open anything at first. I just counted. 10 missed calls, 15, 20. The timestamps were close together, like someone pacing back and forth while dialing. When I finally unlocked the screen, the messages filled the display, one pushing the next upward before I could finish the line. The first one sounded almost normal. "Are you okay? Please call me. I'm worried." They used my name the way she used to when she wanted me to soften. Then the tone shifted. "Why are you ignoring me?" "This isn't funny. You need to answer your phone." The words came faster now, the spaces between them shrinking. I set the phone down and went to make coffee. The machine hissed and sputtered, loud in the quiet kitchen. I focused on the ordinary steps, the scoop of grounds, the click of the lid, the smell filling the air. When I picked the phone up again, there were more. Accusations had replaced concern. "You're being irresponsible. You're making this worse. Think about your son." That line made my jaw tighten. It was familiar. The way she reached for Ethan when she wanted leverage, not because she cared how he felt, but because she knew I would. I didn't respond. I took screenshots instead, saving them in a folder I'd labeled with the date. Each tap felt like a small act of control, not over her, but over myself. By mid-morning, the messages had grown sharper, shorter. "Call me now. You don't understand what you're risking." The shift was unmistakable. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about something unraveling, something that needed my voice, my confirmation, my cooperation to hold together. I noticed what never appeared. "I'm sorry. Are you safe? How is Ethan?" The absence spoke louder than the words flooding my phone. This wasn't remorse. It was damage control. A new vibration cut through my thoughts. This one wasn't from Rachel. It was an email from the bank's fraud department, flagged urgent. My chest tightened as I opened it. The language was formal and detached. Certain transfers were under review. Temporary holds had been placed pending verification. They needed additional documentation. My silence suddenly had context. The timing lined up too cleanly to ignore. Her panic hadn't come from nowhere. It had a trigger. Whatever she had expected to happen next hadn't, and now the system was asking questions she couldn't answer alone. The phone buzzed again, and this time I saw a different number flash across the screen. Unknown. I let it ring out. A voicemail followed, her voice tight and controlled, trying for calm and missing it by inches. "Just call me back," she said. "Say something so I can fix this." Fix it for who? The question settled in my mind and stayed there. Not for me, not for Ethan, for herself. I silenced the phone and slid it into the drawer beneath the counter. The quiet that followed felt strange, like stepping into a room after a loud party ends. My ears rang for a moment, then adjusted. I made lunch for Ethan and listened to him talk about school, about a group project he was excited about. He didn't notice the drawer. He didn't need to. When I checked the phone later, the count had climbed again. More texts, more missed calls. The words had grown desperate now, swinging wildly between pleading and anger. You're blowing this out of proportion? I was just trying to help. You're overreacting. The justifications were layered over each other, each one contradicting the last. I read them once, then stopped. Reading again wouldn't give me new information. I already understood the pattern. She needed engagement. Any engagement. Silence was the one thing she couldn't work around. That afternoon, another message arrived. Different from the rest. Short, careful, please. This is time sensitive. You have to respond today. The urgency sat there, naked and unmasked. I imagined the clock she was watching, the deadlines she was racing, the explanation she couldn't provide without my voice backing hers up. I closed the app without replying and went for a walk with Ethan around the block. The air was cool, leaves skittering across the sidewalk. He talked about a neighbor's dog and a science experiment he wanted to try. His world felt intact, safe. That mattered more than anything vibrating in a drawer back home. When we returned, the phone was still quiet. The silence felt earned now, not fragile. I pulled the drawer open and looked at the screen one last time. The numbers stared back at me, absurd in their volume. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. That evening, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he asked if everything was okay. I told him the truth I could manage. We're handling it, I said, and we're safe. He nodded and rolled onto his side, trusting me in a way that felt both heavy and right. After he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I organized the files, labeled dates, drafted a list of questions for the bank. The work was methodical, almost soothing. Outside, the neighborhood settled into night, lights flicking off one by one. My phone buzzed once more from the drawer. I didn't get up to check it. Whatever she was trying to reach through the noise, it wasn't something I needed to hear. By choosing not to respond, I hadn't started a fight. I had ended a pattern. And somewhere on the other side of my silence, a plan built on my compliance was collapsing under its own weight. The morning after the phone finally went quiet felt heavier than the night before. No vibrations, no stacked notifications. Just a stillness that made me pause before picking the phone up, as if I could sense movement happening somewhere else without me. The silence wasn't relief. It was anticipation. When I checked my email, I understood why. A message from the bank's fraud department sat unread at the top of my inbox. The subject line was neutral, procedural, the kind that doesn't care about family dynamics or intentions. I opened it and read slowly. The review had escalated. Certain accounts were temporarily restricted pending verification. Additional documentation would be required. They would be contacting all parties involved. All parties. The phrase landed with a quiet finality. Whatever Rachel had planned, it was no longer something she could fix with a phone call or a well-timed explanation. The system had noticed, and systems don't get tired or sentimental. I set the phone down and made breakfast, moving carefully through the familiar routine. Eggs in the pan, toast popping up. Ethan wandered in, rubbing his eyes, calm and unhurried. He didn't glance at my phone once. Watching him eat, relaxed and focused on his day, made something click. The chaos had been entering our home through my reactions. Without them, the house was steadier. Mid-morning, another email arrived, this one requesting copies of statements and confirmation of authorized access. I gathered the documents I'd already prepared and sent them off. Each attachment felt like placing a brick in a wall I should have built sooner. There was no satisfaction in it. Just a growing sense that I was finally doing what needed to be done. I resisted the urge to reach out to Rachel, even as curiosity tugged at me. I didn't need to hear her version. I already knew the shape of it. Engaging now wouldn't protect me. It would only give her another opening. The attorney's words echoed in my head. Let the process work. Distance matters. By early afternoon, a message came through from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't open it. The preview was enough. Please just tell them it was a misunderstanding. The wording was careful, stripped of emotion. She was trying a different door, hoping one would open. I left it unread and took a screenshot instead. Doubt crept in around the edges of my resolve. Was I being too hard? Was silence really the right response? I imagined the version of myself from a year ago, the one who would have rushed to smooth things over, who would have absorbed the stress to keep the peace. That version felt distant now, like someone I knew once but no longer recognized. Ethan came home from school buzzing about a presentation he'd volunteered to give. He talked through his ideas while I listened, nodding, offering small suggestions. He seemed lighter than he had in weeks, unburdened by adult tension. I realized then that whatever storm Rachel was facing, it wasn't spilling into our space anymore. That alone was worth holding the line. Late in the day, the bank called. The conversation was brief and formal. They explained the next steps, the timeline, the limits of what they could discuss. They didn't ask how I felt. They didn't care who Rachel was to me. They cared about records and authorizations and discrepancies. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the reality. This had moved beyond me. That evening, my phone buzzed again. A message from Rachel, different from the others. No exclamation points, no accusations. I didn't think it would get this far, she wrote. You need to help me fix this. There was fear in the words, thinly disguised as pragmatism. I read it once and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not triumph, just clarity. She wasn't asking how I was holding up. She wasn't asking about Ethan. She was still asking me to step back into the role I'd always played, the buffer between her actions and their consequences. I put the phone down without replying. My hands didn't shake. The decision felt settled, like a door closing quietly instead of slamming. That night, after Ethan was asleep, I stood at the kitchen sink and watched the streetlight cast a pale circle on the pavement outside. I thought about how easily I had confused silence with abandonment in the past, how often I'd filled it with apologies and explanations that weren't mine to give. This time, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was doing work. I knew Rachel would keep trying, through messages, through other people, through any openings she could find. But I also knew something had shifted permanently. She could no longer rely on my voice to steady her story. The systems were moving forward without me, and for once, that was exactly what needed to happen. When I finally went to bed, the phone stayed on the kitchen counter. I didn't bring it with me. I didn't need to monitor the fallout in real time. Whatever consequences were unfolding, they weren't mine to manage. As I turned off the light, one thought settled in with a calm certainty. I hadn't exposed my sister. I had simply stopped protecting her. And without that protection, the truth was finding its own way to the surface. The message came in the late afternoon when the house was quiet and the light had turned soft and gold. It didn't buzz the way the others had. It didn't demand attention. It simply appeared, a single notification that felt heavier than the dozens before it. I knew it was different before I even opened it. Rachel's words were careful this time, measured. No accusations, No anger. She wrote like someone who had finally realized shouting wouldn't work. She said things were getting complicated. She said people were asking questions. She said she needed me to confirm something, just one thing, to make it stop. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention Ethan. She asked for help the way someone asks for a tool they believe still belongs to them. I read the message once and set the phone down. I didn't feel the rush of fear I'd expected. I felt tired in a clean, honest way, the kind that comes after a long decision has finally been made. The pattern was unmistakable now. Even stripped of rage, her words still placed me where I had always been, between her actions and their consequences. I sat there for a while, staring at the blank screen, thinking about how many times I'd rushed to respond in the past, how quickly I'd filled silence with explanations, reassurances, compromises. I imagined what replying now would do. It wouldn't end anything. It would reopen everything. One sentence would become a conversation. A conversation would become negotiations. Negotiations would become pressure. I knew this because I had lived it. For the first time, I didn't feel tempted to try. That evening, a distant relative called. Someone Rachel had always kept close. The conversation was awkward, careful. They didn't accuse me of anything, but the implication hung there. Had I heard from her? Did I know what was going on? I kept my answers short and factual. I said I was handling things through the proper channels. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. When the call ended, my hands were steady. Later, an email came from the bank confirming the next steps, timelines, documentation, procedures that would continue whether I participated emotionally or not. Reading it, I understood something that surprised me. The outcome no longer felt like the point. Whether I recovered everything or not, the shape of my life had already changed. Ethan came into the kitchen while I was making dinner, carrying a piece of paper covered in pencil marks. "I finished my outline," he said, proud and hopeful. We sat together at the table while he explained his ideas. His voice animated, his shoulders relaxed. He didn't glance at my phone. He didn't ask about Rachel. He trusted that if something mattered, I would tell him. That trust settled something inside me for good. After dinner, when the house had gone quiet again, I picked up my phone and looked at Rachel's message one last time. I imagined the sister I thought I had. The woman who used to sit across from me and talk about plans, about family, about looking out for each other. I allowed myself to feel the grief of losing that version of her. It hurt. It always would. But grief didn't mean obligation. I didn't reply. I didn't draft a response and delete it. I didn't type and hesitate. I locked the screen and set the phone face down on the table. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt complete. The next day, word reached me indirectly. Rachel was telling people she didn't understand how things had gone so wrong. She said she'd only been trying to help. She said I'd shut her out without warning. I let the story pass without correction. Anyone who mattered would see the truth eventually. Anyone who didn't wasn't my responsibility to convince. There was a quiet sadness in knowing she still didn't understand why this was happening. Or maybe she understood and couldn't accept it. Either way, it wasn't something I could fix without hurting myself and my son again. That afternoon, as Ethan worked on homework at the table, I realized how different the house felt. Lighter. Not because the situation was resolved, but because the tension had stopped cycling through me. I wasn't absorbing it anymore. I wasn't translating it into something manageable for everyone else. When another message came through later that night, I didn't open it. I recognized the preview tone, the careful phrasing, the attempt to sound reasonable. I deleted the notification without reading further. It felt like closing a door I'd already walked away from. Standing at the sink, washing dishes, I thought about how often people confuse boundaries with cruelty, how silence is labeled as punishment instead of protection. I hadn't cut Rachel off out of anger. I had stepped back because staying engaged meant continuing a pattern that hurt my child and hollowed me out. Before bed, Ethan hugged me and said goodnight, lingering a little longer than usual. "I like it when it's quiet," he said softly. "So do I answered, and meant it. Lying in the dark later, I felt the full weight of what I'd done settle into place. I had chosen not to save someone who had chosen to harm us. I had accepted that some relationships don't end with understanding or apology. They end with distance and clarity. Rachel might never admit what she did. She might carry her version of the story forever. I couldn't control that. What I could control was the example I set for my son. That love doesn't require self-destruction. That family doesn't get unlimited access to your life. That walking away can be an act of responsibility, not betrayal. The phone stayed silent on the nightstand. And for the first time since everything began, the silence didn't feel like waiting. It felt like freedom. Life didn't snap back into place after that. There was no morning where everything suddenly felt normal again. Instead, there were quiet weeks where the house stayed calm, the phone stayed mostly silent, and I learned how to live without bracing for the next disruption. The noise was gone, but the aftermath remained, steady and real. Not all of the money came back. Some of it was frozen, tied up in processes that moved slowly and without emotion. Some of it, I was told, might never return. I listened, asked questions, signed forms, and accepted answers I didn't like. What surprised me wasn't the disappointment. It was how little it shook me compared to what I'd already lost and rebuilt inside myself. I started over in small, unremarkable ways. New accounts, new passwords, no shared access, no shortcuts disguised as help. I rebuilt the savings the way I'd built it the first time, patiently, carefully, one decision at a time. It felt slower now, but it also felt honest. Every dollar had a place. Every choice was mine. Ethan adjusted faster than I expected. He slept through the night again. He laughed more easily. He stopped watching my face for signs of tension. One afternoon, while we were folding laundry together, he told me he liked our place the way it was. "It feels safe," he said, like that settled the question of houses and plans and timelines. That was when I realized something important. The house fund had never really been about the house. It had been about safety, about knowing where we stood, about not having to explain our lives to anyone else. Losing the money had hurt, but losing the illusion that family automatically provided protection had hurt more. Letting go of that illusion, painful as it was, made room for something sturdier. The idea of a house didn't disappear. It just changed shape. It stopped being a deadline and became a direction. Someday, maybe, we would have a place with a porch and a yard. Or maybe home would look different than I imagined. Either way, it wouldn't be built on borrowed certainty or someone else's control. I thought about Rachel sometimes, not with anger, and not with the hope that she would suddenly understand. I grieved the sister I thought I had, the version of our relationship that felt safe once. I let myself remember the good moments without using them as excuses for the harm that followed. Love, I learned, doesn't cancel out accountability. What stayed with me most was the clarity. Silence had taught me more than confrontation ever could. By stepping back, I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stopped holding it together for someone else. The consequences that followed weren't revenge. They were the natural result of no longer shielding someone from their own choices. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't part of our daily lives. I stopped rehearsing justifications for boundaries I no longer questioned. If someone didn't understand why I chose distance, I let them misunderstand. Peace didn't require consensus. One night, I found Ethan at the table drawing. He'd sketched our apartment, the two of us inside, windows bright. Underneath, he'd written a sentence in careful letters. Home is where people don't disappear. I stood there longer than I meant to, letting the truth of it settle. I used to think strength meant enduring things quietly, absorbing damage so others wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable. Now I know strength can look like refusal, like not answering the phone, like letting systems and boundaries do the work they're meant to do, like choosing your child's sense of safety over someone else's sense of entitlement. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who shared your last name, if you've ever been made to feel cruel for protecting yourself, I want you to know this. You're not wrong for drawing a line. You're not heartless for stepping back. And you're not obligated to keep paying the price for someone else's choices. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to confront, but to stop cooperating. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stop protecting someone who was hurting you? What boundary do you wish you'd drawn sooner? Share your experience in the comments. You never know who might need to read it. And if you're drawn to stories about quiet justice, self-respect, and rebuilding after betrayal, consider staying here with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. These conversations matter, and you don't have to navigate them alone. I didn't keep everything I lost, but I kept what mattered most: my son, my dignity, and the knowledge that my story didn't end when someone tried to take advantage of my silence. It changed when I decided my silence would protect us instead. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.